The stagecoach rolled into Redemption, Springs amid a cloud of dust and disappointment. Dr. Charlotte Hayes gripped her medical bag tighter as the conveyance lurched to a stop, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Through the window, she surveyed what was to be her new home, a single dusty street lined with weathered buildings, most advertising whiskey in faded paint. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver called, opening the door with a creak that matched. His joints. Redemption Springs. A rather optimistic name, Charlotte murmured, accepting his calloused hand as she descended. "Town was founded by a preacher with more hope than sense," the man replied with a chuckle. "Redemption's in short supply, but the springs are real enough." Charlotte nodded, squinting against the merciless Arizona sun. At 31, she was too old for girlish idealism and too young for defeat, though the past year had brought her perilously close to the latter. "Your trunks, ma'am." The driver gestured to her luggage. "The Wilcox Hotel, please," she replied, brushing trail dust from her practical Navy traveling suit. "I've arranged accommodations there until more suitable lodgings can be secured." As the driver unloaded her possessions, Charlotte took stock of her surroundings more carefully. A general store, a blacksmith shop, 2 saloons, one decidedly more respectable than the other, and a small building with sheriff painted on a weathered sign. No indication of a doctor's office or apothecary. At least there would be no direct competition for her services. Dr. Hayes? Charlotte turned to find a plump woman hurrying toward her, gray hair escaping a severe bun, her face creased with what appeared to be perpetual worry. "Mrs. Wilcox, I presume." Charlotte extended her hand. The woman clasped it briefly. "Indeed, we received your letter last month. I must say we were expecting a male physician." "So I've found throughout my career," Charlotte replied evenly. "I assure you my qualifications remain unaffected by my gender." Mrs. Wilcox's expression suggested she remained unconvinced, but was too polite to say so directly. "Well, your room is ready. My husband would help with your trunks, but his lumbago is troubling him something fierce. Perhaps I might examine him while I'm in residence," Charlotte offered, as a gesture of appreciation for your hospitality. Before Mrs. Wilcox could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. A man staggered through the swinging doors, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "You cheating snake," he bellowed, drawing a revolver from his holster. "I'll send you to hell where you belong." Charlotte instinctively stepped forward, but Mrs. Wilcox caught her arm. "Don't," the older woman warned. "Sheriff Blackwood will handle it." As if summoned by her words, a tall figure emerged from the sheriff's office. He moved unhurriedly yet, with purpose, like a mountain lion sizing up its territory. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight as he approached the bleeding man. "Put it away, Turner," his voice carried across the street, low but commanding. "You're drunk and you're wrong. He cheated me." Turner insisted, wavering on his feet but maintaining his grip on the revolver. "Then you've been cheated out of what, $2? The sheriff's tone was almost conversational. "Is that worth hanging for?" Charlotte watched, fascinated by the subtle tension in the sheriff's stance. Despite his calm demeanor, she recognized the coiled readiness of a man prepared for violence. "The man's bleeding, Sheriff," Turner slurred. "Means I already got the drop on him once." "That you did," Sheriff Blackwood agreed. "And he's not pressing charges because he knows better. Walk away now, sleep it off, and we'll call it even." For a moment, Charlotte thought Turner might actually fire. Her breath caught as the drunk man's finger twitched near the trigger. Then, with surprising swiftness, the sheriff closed the distance between them. His hand clamped around Turner's wrist, twisting until the revolver clattered to the dirt. In the same fluid motion, he spun the man around and pressed him against the saloon wall. "I said," the sheriff repeated, steel in his voice now, "walk away." He released Turner, who stumbled, rubbing his wrist and muttering curses, but making no further attempts at violence. The sheriff collected the fallen weapon and tucked it into his own belt. "You can collect this tomorrow," he called after the retreating man, "when you're sober." Only then did Sheriff Blackwood seem to notice the small audience that had gathered. His gaze swept over the onlookers, pausing briefly when it reached Charlotte. Something flickered in his eyes' curiosity. Perhaps before, he nodded curtly to Mrs. Wilcox and returned to his office. "That's Jesse Blackwood," Mrs. Wilcox explained, as they resumed their walk to the hotel. "Been sheriff here 3 years now. Keeps the peace well enough, though some say he learned his trade on the wrong side of the law first." "A reformed outlaw as sheriff?" Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "That seems a peculiar choice. Redemption Springs was named such for a reason." "Doctor," Mrs. Wilcox replied cryptically. "Now, let me show you to your room. I imagine you'll want to rest after your journey." The Wilcox Hotel proved modestly comfortable, a 2-story structure with clean, spare rooms. Charlotte's accommodations consisted of a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the main street. After arranging her most essential belongings and washing away the worst of the travel grime, she decided a proper introduction to the town was in order. Her first stop was the general store, where she hoped to inquire about suitable space for her medical practice. The bell jangled cheerfully as she entered, a stark contrast to the suspicious look the proprietor gave her when she explained her purpose in Redemption Springs. "A lady doctor?" The man Abel Morgan, according to the sign above the counter, shook his head in disbelief. "Town council sent for a doctor, true enough, but we was expecting someone more. ... Male?" Charlotte supplied with practiced patience. "I assure you, Mr. Morgan, my training at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania and subsequent practice in Boston have prepared me adequately for frontier medicine." Morgan looked unconvinced. "Don't know that folks around here will cotton to a woman doctor. When someone is bleeding or delivering a child, Mr. Morgan, they rarely concern themselves with the gender of the person providing assistance." Charlotte maintained her professional smile. "Now, regarding suitable premises for my practice?" Before Morgan could respond, the door opened behind Charlotte. She turned to find Sheriff Blackwood filling the entrance, his tall frame nearly touching the door jamb. Up close, she could better appreciate the weathered contours of his face strewn jawed, with deep creases around eyes that had seen too much. A thin scar bisected his left eyebrow, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his cheeks. "Sheriff," Morgan nodded. "What can I do for you?" "Tobacco," Blackwood replied simply. His gaze shifted to Charlotte, assessing her with the same careful attention he'd given Turner during their confrontation. "You're new. Dr. Charlotte Hayes." She extended her hand. "Recently arrived from Boston." He stared at her hand for a moment before taking it briefly. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but controlled. "Doctor," he repeated, skepticism evident. "Of medicine?" "No, Sheriff, of philosophy. I simply carry this medical bag as a fashionable accessory," Charlotte replied dryly before she could stop herself. To her surprise, the corner of Blackwood's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Town council did send for a doctor," he conceded. "Didn't specify what kind, I suppose?" "Indeed not. And as I was just explaining to Mr. Morgan, my qualifications are substantial regardless of my gender." The sheriff considered her for a moment. "Longer. Old Doc Pearson's place is still empty, next to the church. Needs work, but it has living quarters in back and space for an examination room." Charlotte blinked, taken aback by the unexpectedly helpful information. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll inquire about it." Blackwood nodded once, collected his tobacco from Morgan, and departed without further conversation. "Well," Morgan said, watching the sheriff's retreating form through the window, That's as close to a blessing as you're likely to get from him. If Blackwood says you can use Doc Pearson's place, nobody's going to argue the point. Is the sheriff on the town council, then? Charlotte asked. No, ma'am. But he keeps us alive, and that earns him some say. Morgan leaned forward conspiratorially. Between us, I'd rather face a band of Apache than cross Jesse Blackwood. Man's got ice in his veins and lightning in his hands. He seems to have the temperament for his position, Charlotte observed neutrally. Morgan chuckled. That's one way of putting it. Now, about Doc Pearson's place keys are with Reverend Mitchell at the church. Old Doc died 6 months back. Influenza. Left his instruments behind when his family took his body east for burial. Might be something useful there for you. Charlotte thanked him and departed, medical bag in hand, toward the small white church at the end of the street. The building stood in stark contrast to its surroundings, freshly whitewashed and well-maintained, with colorful glass windows that must have been transported at considerable expense. She found Reverend Mitchell in the small cemetery behind the church, tending to a grave. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 40, with kind eyes and premature gray at his temples. Reverend, she called softly, not wishing to startle him. I'm Dr. Hayes. I understand you might have the keys to Dr. Pearson's former residence? Mitchell straightened, brushing dirt from his knees. The doctor from back east? We've been expecting you. His gaze held none of the skepticism she'd encountered elsewhere. Though I admit I hadn't anticipated a woman. Few do, Charlotte replied with a small smile. Will that be a problem? God's work comes in many forms, Doctor, Mitchell said simply. If you're here to heal, your gender matters not to me. He retrieved the keys from the church and personally escorted her to Pearson's former practice, a modest but sturdy structure. Between the church and the town's small schoolhouse, the building smelled of dust and disuse when they entered. Sheets draped the furniture, and cobwebs adorned the corners. But Charlotte could see the potential immediately, a small waiting area, an examination room with adequate light, and living quarters consisting of a bedroom, sitting room, and tiny kitchen. It's perfect, she declared, already envisioning where she would place her equipment. It needs a thorough cleaning, Mitchell warned, and possibly some repairs. Nothing that can't be managed. Charlotte ran her hand along the examination table, displacing a layer of dust. What can you tell me? About Dr. Pearson? Good man. Trained in Philadelphia before the war. Came west afterward, like many. Served this community for nearly 20 years. Mitchell's expression grew somber. When the influenza hit last winter, he worked himself to exhaustion caring for others. His own resistance was low when he finally contracted it himself. Charlotte nodded, understanding all too well the physician's dilemma, how to care for others while maintaining one's own health. And the instruments he left behind? She inquired. In there. Mitchell pointed to a large wooden cabinet. His family took his personal effects, but said the medical equipment should remain for his successor. Charlotte opened the cabinet to find an impressive array of instruments, surgical kits, obstetrical forceps, stethoscope, and more, all of good quality and well-maintained despite the recent neglect. This is extraordinarily helpful, she said, genuine gratitude in her voice. It would have been quite expensive to replace these items. I'm glad. Mitchell smiled warmly. Now, about your arrangement with the town council. They've agreed to provide the premises rent-free for 6 months, after which a modest sum will be expected. In exchange, you'll attend to the town's medical needs, with patients paying what they can for services. That seems fair, Charlotte agreed. Though I should warn you, Reverend, that my methods may occasionally conflict with local customs. I believe in science and empirical evidence. As did Dr. Pearson, Mitchell assured her. Faith and science need not be enemies, Doctor. Both seek truth in their own way. As they concluded their business, Charlotte felt the first stirrings of hope since leaving Boston. Perhaps here, in this rough frontier town with its optimistic name, she might indeed find the redemption she sought. It took 3 days of intense cleaning and organizing before Charlotte was satisfied with her new premises. Mrs. Wilcox had helped her hire 2 local women for the heaviest work, and by the end of the 3rd day, the building gleamed with unaccustomed cleanliness. Charlotte had arranged Pearson's instruments alongside her own, stocked what supplies she had brought, and created a workspace that, while modest, met her exacting standards. On the morning of the 4th day, she placed a sign in the window. Dr. Charlotte Hayes, physician and surgeon. Hours 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. She hadn't expected an immediate rush of patients, and indeed, the morning passed quietly. Charlotte used the time to inventory what medicines she had and what she would need to order. Around noon, a tentative knock at the door announced her. First visitor a young woman, perhaps 20, cradling a fussy infant. Doctor? The woman lingered in the doorway, uncertain. I heard a new doctor had come. Is it true you're a lady doctor? It is, Charlotte confirmed, rising from her desk. Please come in. I'm Dr. Hayes. I'm Mary Dawson. This is my boy, Samuel. The woman entered hesitantly. He's had a cough for near a week now. My husband says it's nothing, but... She trailed off, her worried eyes fixed on her child. A mother's. Instincts are often correct, Charlotte said gently. May I examine him? Over the next half hour, Charlotte conducted a thorough examination, diagnosed a mild respiratory infection, and prepared a syrup of wild cherry bark and honey to ease the cough. Throughout, she explained her findings and recommendations to Mary, who listened with increasing confidence. Doc Pearson never told me why he was giving medicines, Mary remarked as she prepared to leave. Just said to trust him and do as told. I believe patients heal better when they understand their treatment, Charlotte replied, wrapping the medicine bottle carefully. And mothers especially should be informed about their children's care. Mary hesitated at the door, clutching her. Baby and the medicine. What do I owe you, doctor? Charlotte considered. The woman's dress was clean, but mended in several places, her shoes well worn. $2, she decided, knowing it was less than the treatment would have cost in Boston, but still respecting the woman's dignity by not offering charity. Mary nodded, producing the coins from a small purse. Thank you, doctor. I'll tell the other ladies about you. After Mary left, Charlotte had 2 more patients, an elderly man with joint pain and a young ranch hand who had sliced his palm open on barbed wire. She treated both competently, charging modest fees and earning cautious approval. By evening, she felt satisfied with her first day, though she knew winning the town's trust would take more than a few successful consultations. She was closing up when a sharp knock came at the door. Sheriff Blackwood stood on her porch, his expression grim. Doctor, you're needed. What's happened? Charlotte reached for her medical bag automatically. Stagecoach robbery attempt 3. Miles east. Driver fought back. Got shot for his trouble. Blackwood's tone was clipped, professional. He's at the saloon. Couldn't move him further. Charlotte nodded, checking her bag's contents quickly. Take me to him. They moved briskly down the street, Blackwood matching his long stride to hers. The men who did this? She inquired. 2 rode off. One's dead. His jaw tightened. Driver got a shot off before he went down. The saloon fell silent as they entered. Patrons parting to reveal, a man stretched out on a makeshift bed of tablecloths on the floor. Blood soaked his shirt, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Charlotte knelt beside him, professional detachment taking over as she assessed his condition. Gunshot wound to the chest, bullet likely still inside, significant blood loss. Labored, breathing suggesting a damaged lung. She cut away his shirt, revealing the wound a small, deadly hole just below his right collarbone. "I need clean water, towels, whiskey, and as much light as you can provide," she ordered, not caring who fulfilled the request so long as they were met. To her mild surprise, it was Blackwood who brought the whiskey and a lamp, positioning it to illuminate her work area. Others scrambled to provide the remaining items. "What's his name?" Charlotte asked as she cleaned the area around the wound. "Joe Mendez," Blackwood replied. "Been running the eastern route for 5 years." Charlotte leaned close to her patient's ear. "Mr. Mendez, I'm Dr. Hayes. You've been shot, and I need to remove the bullet. I won't lie to you, this will be painful." Mendez's eyes flickered open, glazed with pain. "Do what you must, doc." Charlotte nodded to Blackwood. "I need you to hold him down. This will take steady hands." For the next 30 minutes, the saloon remained hushed as Charlotte worked, extracting the bullet with Pearson's instruments and repairing what damage she could. Throughout the procedure, Blackwood maintained a steady pressure on Mendez's shoulders, his expression impassive despite the gruesome nature of the surgery. When she finally straightened, her hands bloodied but her work complete, Charlotte met the sheriff's questioning gaze. "He has a chance," she said quietly, "but he'll need careful watching through the night." Blackwood nodded once. "I'll have him moved to a room upstairs." "No," Charlotte shook her head firmly. "Too risky to move him now. I'll stay here with him." Something like respect flickered in the sheriff's eyes. "As you say, doctor." As promised, Charlotte remained with her patient through the night, monitoring his condition from a chair beside his makeshift bed. The saloon owner had cleared the establishment, leaving only Charlotte, Mendez, and surprisingly, Sheriff Blackwood, who stationed himself by the door. "You don't need to stay, Sheriff," Charlotte said around midnight, her voice low to avoid disturbing her sleeping patient. "I can manage." "Those robbers had partners," Blackwood replied simply. "They might come looking to finish what they started." Charlotte studied him in the lamplight. Despite the late hour, he remained alert, his posture suggesting a man accustomed to vigilance. "You believe they'll return tonight?" she asked. "No, but belief and certainty are different things." He shifted slightly in his chair. "How's Mendez?" "Holding his own. If infection doesn't set in, he has a good chance." Charlotte stretched her stiff shoulders. "You handled yourself well during the surgery. Most men faint at the sight of such procedures." A hint of amusement crossed Blackwood's face. "I've seen worse." "In your former profession?" The words slipped out before she could reconsider them. His expression closed immediately. "Town gossip travels fast. Mrs. Wilcox mentioned your background might be unconventional for a lawman." Blackwood was silent for so long that Charlotte thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "We all have pasts, Doctor. Some more checkered than others." He met her gaze directly. "Judge me by what I do now, not by what I've done." The statement hung between them, a challenge, perhaps, or a plea for understanding that resonated with Charlotte's own circumstances. "That seems a reasonable request," she replied quietly. "One I might make myself." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle recognition, quickly masked. Before he could respond, Mendez stirred, moaning softly. Charlotte moved immediately to her patient's side, professional concerns displacing the unexpected moment of connection dot by dawn. It was clear Mendez would survive, barring complications. Charlotte showed the saloon owner how to change the bandages and administer the medicine she'd prepared, promising to return in a few hours after she'd rested. Outside, the town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their establishments as the sun crested the distant mountains. Sheriff Blackwood walked beside Charlotte as she made her way back to her quarters, both of them weary from the night's vigil. "You did good work in there," he said as they reached her door. "Town's fortunate to have a capable physician." "Even a female one?" Charlotte couldn't resist asking. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Even so." As he turned to leave, Charlotte called after him, "Sheriff, thank you for your assistance last night." He acknowledged her gratitude with a nod before continuing down the street toward his office. His tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Charlotte watched him go, an unexpected warmth looming beneath her exhaustion. Perhaps, she thought, as she finally sought her bed, Redemption Springs would prove aptly named after all. News of Charlotte's successful surgery spread quickly through Redemption Springs. By the end of her first week, she had treated a steady stream of patients, mostly women and children at first. Then gradually the men of the town, as her reputation for skill and discretion grew. She established a routine, seeing patients during the day and spending evenings organizing her supplies and keeping meticulous records. Occasionally, she joined the Wilcoxes for dinner, learning more about the town's history and inhabitants from their colorful narratives. Sheriff Blackwood arrived 3 years ago, Mrs. Wilcox explained one evening over roast chicken. Town was different, then no law to speak of, just whoever had the biggest gun making the rules, which was usually Silas Harding and his boys. Mr. Wilcox added, his voice lowering as if the name itself might conjure trouble. Ran everything from the Diamond H Ranch north of town. Nobody crossed Harding and stayed breathing long. What happened? Charlotte asked, intrigued despite herself. The Wilcoxes exchanged glances. Blackwood happened, Mrs. Wilcox said simply. Rode into town one day, pinned on the badge the previous sheriff had abandoned, and informed Harding's men they'd be following the law from then on. They laughed at him, of course, Mr. Wilcox continued, until he put 3 of them in the ground, before they could clear leather. After that, folks started wondering who this stranger really was. And did they discover his identity? Charlotte prompted when they fell silent. Mrs. Wilcox leaned forward. Some say he rode with the Cassidy gang before turning to the law. Others claim he was a Pinkerton detective who went rogue. Truth is, nobody knows for certain, and Blackwood doesn't discuss his past. What matters, Mr. Wilcox concluded firmly, is that he brought order to Redemption Springs when we needed it most. A man's past is his own business. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, understanding all too well the desire to leave one's history. Behind after dinner, she declined the offer to stay for cards, citing patient notes that needed attention. In truth, she wanted time alone to think. The walk back to her quarters took her past the sheriff's office, where a lamp still burned despite the late hour. On impulse, Charlotte paused at the door and knocked lightly. "It's open," came Blackwood's voice from within. She found him at his desk, cleaning a disassembled revolver with methodical precision. He looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression returned to its usual impassivity. "Doctor, something wrong?" "No," Charlotte replied, suddenly uncertain why she had stopped. "I was passing by and saw your light. I wanted to thank you again for your help with Mr. Mendez." Blackwood nodded, resuming his work on the weapon. "He's recovering well, from what I hear." "Yes, remarkably so." Charlotte hesitated, then added, "I understand from the Wilcoxes that I have you to thank for the relative peace in Redemption Springs." His hand stilled momentarily. "The Wilcoxes talk too much." "It was meant as a compliment," Charlotte said, mildly. Blackwood looked up again, studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "Was it? Or were you satisfying your curiosity about the reformed outlaw?" The directness of the question caught Charlotte off guard. "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted after a moment. "We all have our mysteries, Sheriff. Some best left unexplored?" He reassembled the revolver with practiced efficiency, each component clicking into place. "Just as I haven't asked What drove a Boston-educated woman physician to a backwater town in Arizona Territory? The implied question hung between them. Charlotte considered deflecting, as she had with others who inquired about her past. Instead, she found herself offering a partial truth. Professional disagreements, she said carefully. My methods were considered unorthodox by some of my male colleagues. Blackwood loaded the revolver before holstering it, his movements unhurried. Unorthodox enough to flee across the country? Some men find a woman with strong opinions more threatening than armed adversaries, Charlotte replied, a edge creeping into her voice, particularly when she's proven right at their expense. A ghost of a smile touched Blackwood's lips. I can imagine. He rose from his desk, towering over her despite her own above-average height. Would you like coffee, Doctor? I just made a pot. The unexpected offer surprised her. Yes, thank you. He poured 2 cups of coffee black as tar and handed one to Charlotte. She sipped cautiously, finding it strong enough to strip paint, but oddly satisfying. Regarding Mendez, Blackwood said, changing the subject. The men who shot him were part of the Creed brothers' gang. Been hitting stagecoaches between here and Tucson for months. Have you caught them? Not yet, but I will. His tone left no doubt of his conviction. They made a mistake, coming this close to town. You sound certain of success. Blackwood's eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. I'm good at finding people who don't want to be found. Something in his tone sent a chill down Charlotte's spine, a reminder that beneath his current role lay a man intimately familiar with violence. She wondered, not for the first time, what circumstances had transformed an outlaw into a defender of law. Their conversation shifted to less fraught topics, the town's needs, the approaching winter, the supply train expected the following week. Charlotte found herself enjoying the sheriff's direct manner and occasional dry observations. He was more educated than his chosen profession might suggest, dropping references that indicated extensive reading. When she finally rose to leave, night had fully descended over Redemption Springs. I should let you return to your duties, she said, placing her empty cup on his desk. Thank you for the coffee, Sheriff. Blackwood, he corrected, or Jesse, if you prefer. Sheriff sounds formal for midnight conversations. Charlotte smiled. Then I'm Charlotte, rather than Doctor. He nodded, walking her to the door. Be careful walking home, Charlotte. Town's mostly peaceful now, but mostly isn't entirely. I've lived in Boston, Jesse. I know how to navigate dark streets. His expression suggested he remained unconvinced, but wouldn't argue the point. Good night, then. Good night. As Charlotte walked the short distance to her quarters, she reflected on the enigmatic lawman. There was more to Jesse Blackwood than the town rumors suggested depth and complexity beneath his taciturn exterior. Despite her better judgment, she found herself intrigued. Such intrigue was dangerous, she reminded herself firmly. She had come to Redemption Springs to practice medicine and escape her past, not to develop an interest in a man with secrets possibly darker than her own. Following weeks established Charlotte more firmly in the community. She treated everything from mining injuries to childbirth, earning respect for both her skill and her discretion. Her gender, initially a barrier, gradually became secondary to her abilities. She saw Jesse Blackwood occasionally during this period brief. Encounters on the street, a nod of acknowledgement when their paths crossed. He remained courteous but distant, their midnight conversations seemingly forgotten. It was early November when trouble arrived in Redemption Springs. Charlotte was treating young Timothy Parker for a broken arm when Mrs. Parker mentioned the newcomers. 3 men checked into the hotel yesterday, she said as Charlotte applied a plaster cast to Timothy's arm. Fancy Eastern clothes, but rough-looking despite it. Been asking questions all over town. What kind of questions? Charlotte asked, focusing. On her work. About newcomers, mostly. particularly interested in new arrivals from back east. Charlotte's hands stilled momentarily before she forced herself to continue. Probably investors looking at the mines, she said with a calmness she didn't feel. Maybe, Mrs. Parker replied doubtfully, but investors don't usually carry guns. Like those men do. After the Parkers left, Charlotte found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks. She paced her small office, mind racing. It could be coincidence traveling businessmen often passed through frontier towns. But her instincts, honed by years of navigating Boston society and its dangers, warned otherwise. By evening, her nerves had frayed to the breaking point. When a knock came at her door after closing hours, she started violently before composing herself. "Who is it?" she called, one hand reaching for the small derringer she kept in her desk drawer. "Blackwood." Charlotte released her breath, unlocking the door to admit the sheriff. His expression was grave. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Privately." She led him to her small sitting room at the back of the building, away from windows visible from the street. "What's happened?" "3 men arrived in town yesterday. They've been asking questions about new arrivals, particularly those from the East Coast." Blackwood's gaze was intent. "They're looking for someone." Charlotte managed to keep her expression neutral. "As sheriff, I imagine people often consult you about newcomers. They haven't approached me yet. They're being careful, gathering information before making official inquiries." He leaned forward slightly. "Charlotte, if you're in trouble, now is the time to tell me, before they find whatever they're looking for." She hesitated, torn between her need for secrecy and the realization that Blackwood might be her only ally if her suspicions proved correct. "What makes you think they're looking for me specifically?" she asked finally. "Because you're the only person who arrived from the East Coast in the past 6 months. And because you flinched when I mentioned them." His voice softened slightly. "I recognize someone running when I see it." Charlotte rose from her chair, moving to the small window that overlooked the back alley. "If they are who I suspect, they're not lawmen," she said carefully. "They would be ... privately employed." "By whom?" She turned to face him. "By Dr. William Sullivan of Boston General Hospital." Blackwood's expression revealed nothing. "And why? Would Dr. Sullivan send men across the country to find you?" Charlotte took a deep breath. "Because I ruined him." Over the next half hour, she related the events that had driven her from Boston, how she had discovered Sullivan deliberately misdiagnosing wealthy female patients with nervous disorders to justify unnecessary and expensive treatments, how she had gathered evidence and presented it to the hospital board, how Sullivan, with his connections and influence, had not only escaped consequences, but had managed to turn the situation against her, painting her as a hysterical woman driven by professional jealousy. "I lost everything," she concluded. "My position at the hospital, my private practice, my reputation. No one would hire me. Patients were warned against consulting me." "So you came west," Blackwood said, understanding in his eyes. "Where competent physicians are scarce enough that my gender and supposed hysteria might be overlooked." Charlotte laughed without humor. "I thought I had traveled far enough to escape Sullivan's reach. Men like that have long memories and longer purses," Blackwood observed. "What do you think these men want? Best case? To ensure I stay gone, possibly with threats against returning east." Charlotte's voice hardened. "Worst case? To create an accident that eliminates any possibility of my allegations resurfacing." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "How certain are you of this connection?" "Not entirely," Charlotte admitted. "But Sullivan vowed I would never practice medicine again. He's not a man who makes idle threats." "Then we'll proceed as if your suspicions are correct." Blackwood rose, decision made. "First priority is confirming their identities, and purpose. And if they are Sullivan's men? Then they'll discover that Redemption Springs protects its own. His tone left no doubt of his resolve. Stay close to town. Don't go out alone, especially after dark. I'll watch these men and learn what I can. As he prepared to leave, Charlotte touched his arm lightly. Thank you, Jesse. I'm not accustomed to having allies in such matters. He covered her hand briefly with his own. Get accustomed to it. After he departed, Charlotte sat in the gathering darkness, turning over their conversation in her mind. She had revealed more to Jesse Blackwood in 1 hour than she had shared with anyone since leaving Boston. The risk terrified her, yet she felt oddly unburdened. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The strangers made their move the following afternoon. Charlotte was organizing her medical supplies when her door opened without the customary knock. She looked up to find 3 men entering her office, well dressed in Eastern fashion, but with the hard eyes and confident stance of those accustomed to violence. Dr. Hayes, the leader greeted her, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Or should I say Dr. Charlotte Hayes of Boston? I believe we have mutual acquaintances. Charlotte set down the bandages she'd been sorting, keeping the counter between herself and the visitors. I'm with a patient shortly, gentlemen. If you require medical attention, I'll need you to wait. The man smiled, the expression never reaching. His eyes. Oh, we're not here for medical services, doctor. We're here on behalf of Dr. William Sullivan, who sends his regards. And there it was confirmation of her worst fears. Charlotte maintained her composure with effort. I see. And what does Dr. Sullivan want after all this time? Assurance of your continued discretion regarding certain professional matters in Boston. A man moved closer to the counter, his companions positioning themselves near the door. He was most distressed to learn you had established a practice here. It suggests a concerning lack of understanding regarding your situation. I'm practicing medicine in a frontier town thousands of miles from Boston, Charlotte replied coldly. That hardly threatens Dr. Sullivan's position. Perhaps not today. The man's tone hardened. But reputations are fragile things, doctor. Today's remote outpost becomes tomorrow's thriving city. Words travel. Is that a threat, Mr. Keller, Thomas Keller. He smiled again. And it's merely an observation. Dr. Sullivan would prefer an amicable resolution, which would entail what, exactly? Your immediate departure from medical practice, preferably from the territory entirely. Keller placed an envelope on the counter. In exchange, Dr. Sullivan offers compensation to ease your transition to a more suitable occupation for a woman of your background. Charlotte didn't touch the envelope. And if I decline? Keller's smile disappeared. Then we would be forced to share certain documents with the good people of Redemption Springs affidavits from respected Boston physicians attesting to your mental instability, your tendency toward dangerous fabrications, your inappropriate behavior toward male colleagues. Lies, Charlotte said flatly. Perhaps. But who would the residents of this town believe a woman they've known for weeks, or the combined testimony of a dozen established male physicians? Keller's voice lowered. Consider carefully, Dr. Hayes. Frontier justice can be unpredictable. Before Charlotte could respond, the office door opened again. Sheriff Blackwood stood in the entrance, his tall frame filling the doorway. Gentlemen, he said mildly, this is an official visit to the town physician? Keller turned smoothly. Sheriff, we were just concluding some business with Dr. Hayes. Business involving medicine? Blackwood stepped fully into the room, his presence immediately altering its dynamics. Of a sort, Keller replied. Private business. Nothing's private in my town when it involves 3 armed men confronting a woman alone. Blackwood's tone remained conversational, but Charlotte noticed his hand resting casually near his holster. "There's been a misunderstanding," Keller said, retrieving the envelope from the counter. "We were delivering a message from a mutual acquaintance in Boston. No confrontation intended. Message delivered, I take it?" Blackwood asked. "Indeed." Keller nodded to Charlotte. "Consider our conversation, Doctor. We'll call again tomorrow for your response." "The doctor's busy tomorrow," Blackwood interjected, "and the day after. In fact, her schedule's full for the foreseeable future." Something dangerous flickered in Keller's eyes. "This doesn't concern you, Sheriff." "Everything in Redemption Springs concerns me." Blackwood moved to the door, opening it in clear dismissal. "Especially when it involves threats to its citizens." For a tense moment, Charlotte thought Keller might challenge the sheriff. Then, with a slight nod, he signaled his companions. "Another time, then." After they departed, Blackwood closed the door and turned to Charlotte. "You were right." "Yes." She sank into a chair, reaction setting in now that the immediate danger had passed. "They want me gone or silenced permanently if I—" "Refuse. That won't happen." Blackwood's voice held absolute conviction. "Did they threaten you directly?" "Not explicitly. They're too careful for that." Charlotte recounted the conversation. "They'll be back, Jesse. Men like that don't give up easily." "Neither do one." He considered for a moment. "You should stay at the Wilcoxes tonight. Safer than here alone." Charlotte straightened, indignation overcoming her momentary weakness. "I won't be driven from my home by threats. If I run now, I'll never stop running." Blackwood studied her, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "Stubborn," he observed, "but not practical." "I didn't come west to be practical," Charlotte retorted. "I came to start over, to practice medicine without interference. If I abandoned that at the first sign of trouble, what was the point of any of it?" A long silence followed her outburst. Finally, Blackwood nodded. "All right, but you won't stay alone. What do you propose?" "I'll be here tonight, on your porch." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "The town. Deputy Wilson can handle one night." Blackwood cut her off. "Decision's made, unless you prefer the Wilcoxes after all." The thought of Jesse Blackwood standing guard outside her door all night stirred complex emotions Charlotte wasn't prepared to examine. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "But this is temporary. I won't live under guard indefinitely. One problem at a time," Blackwood advised. "First, we deal with Sullivan's men." "And how do you propose to do that?" "They haven't broken any laws yet." A slow smile spread across Blackwood's face, not the fleeting quirk of lips she'd seen before, but a genuine expression that transformed his features. Who said anything about laws? The statement should have alarmed her. Instead, Charlotte found herself returning his smile, a surge of something like exhilaration replacing her earlier fear. Whatever Jesse Blackwood had been before becoming sheriff, that man was still present beneath the badge, and in this situation, she suspected his past might prove more valuable than his present authority. "I'll see my remaining patients," she said. "Then we can discuss strategy over dinner." Blackwood nodded, his expression returning to its usual inscrutability. "I'll be back at sundown." After he left, Charlotte forced herself to focus on her work, seeing 3 more patients before closing time. None mentioned the Eastern visitors, suggesting Keller and his companions were being discreet about their purpose in town, not as promised. Blackwood returned at sundown, this time carrying his Winchester rifle in addition to his revolver. He accepted. The simple meal Charlotte prepared beef stew and biscuits with appreciation, eating with the efficiency of a man accustomed to viewing food as fuel rather than pleasure. "What can you tell me about these men?" he asked as they finished eating, beyond their connection to Sullivan. Charlotte considered the question. "Keller is intelligent, educated. The others deferred to him. He speaks like a gentleman, but moves like a predator. Former military. Possibly, Blackwood suggested. The tall one has the bearing of a soldier. What do they want, truly? Charlotte mused. Sullivan's reputation is secure in Boston. Why pursue me across the country? Fear, Blackwood said simply. Men like Sullivan don't tolerate threats to their position, no matter how distant. You know something that could harm him, so you must be controlled or eliminated. I have no proof beyond my word, Charlotte pointed out. The hospital board destroyed my evidence when they dismissed my claims. Blackwood's gaze sharpened. All of it? Charlotte hesitated. I kept copies of some documents' patient records, showing Sullivan's diagnoses alongside my own examinations contradicting them. But they're not here. I left them with a trusted friend in Denver for safekeeping. That explains their urgency, Blackwood said. They need to ensure those documents never resurface. The realization chilled Charlotte. If Sullivan's men believed she still possessed evidence against him, they wouldn't be satisfied until they had confirmed its destruction, or hers, as darkness fell completely. Blackwood positioned himself on Charlotte's small porch, rifle across, his knees refusing her offer of a chair. I'll stand watch properly, he insisted. Get some rest, Charlotte. Tomorrow may be eventful. Sleep proved elusive despite her fatigue. Charlotte lay awake, listening to the occasional sounds of Blackwood moving on her porch, finding strange comfort in his presence. Eventually, she drifted into uneasy slumber, her dreams haunted by faceless men in Eastern suits and the steady gaze of a sheriff with a mysterious past.